The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. The alarms were already screaming as the yard flooded with guards, but none of them moved toward the center fast enough. The inmates had stopped talking, stopped pacing, stopped pretending they didn't see what was unfolding. Every eye was fixed on the same thing. Two hardened men, both covered in ink that climbed from their shoulders to their faces, standing so close their breaths almost touched. Darius Stoneback, Rendell, the man everyone whispered about but never looked at for more than a second, stood with his hands behind his back like he owned the entire place. His tattoos told stories nobody dared ask about. Black towers circling his neck, an iron gate etched across his ribs, a pair of wolves inked over his collarbones. People liked to say the wolves looked too alive, too real. Across from him was Miguel Halo Serrano, younger, slimmer, but known for an edge that made officers watch him twice before walking past. A faded sun tattoo covered his left hand, the rays stretching up his wrist like a chain of fire. His jaw twitched once, tight and sharp, as if holding back something he didn't want anyone to see. A space formed around them on Yard C, a circle of tense air shaped by fear and the kind of respect nobody earns without giving up pieces of their soul. Even the wind felt wrong, too still, like it didn't want to interfere. Stoneback's voice came out low, almost calm. "You sure you want to do this, kid?" Halo didn't blink. "You already know the answer." The yard gates clanged shut behind a line of officers rushing in, but they still didn't get close. They moved slow, hands near their belts, eyes sharp, waiting for a signal. Any signal that things were about to explode. Everyone knew why the two men were standing there. For weeks, rumors had slipped through the cell blocks about a power shift in Salinas Valley, something big enough to break years of fragile balance. Block A had gone quiet. Block D had gone louder. Notes had been passed, favors traded, threats delivered in whispers that floated all the way up to the administration wing. Every inmate felt the air changing long before the yard alarms ever did. But no one expected the tension to reach this point. Stoneback leaned forward just enough for Halo to notice. "You walk away now," he said quietly, "and this place stays the way it is." "And if I don't?" Halo asked. Stoneback's eyes narrowed just a little. "Then everything you think you understand about this prison ends today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not loud, not wild, just a low hum, like the sound of a storm rolling toward shore. This wasn't about two men. Everyone could feel that. This was bigger, heavier, more dangerous than any fight the yard had seen in years. One of the guards yelled, "Back up. Everyone step away now." But no one moved. Not even the officers closest to the pair wanted to be the first to cross that invisible line. Halo cracked his neck once and took a step forward. Stoneback's foot shifted. The entire yard held its breath. And that was the moment, the exact moment, when the balance of Salinas Valley State Prison threatened to snap. A single step, a single move, and 10 years of quiet agreements, secret alliances, and razor-thin rules would come crashing down. But before anything could happen, a shout echoed from the far end of the yard. "Warden on the field." Every head turned. But the warden wasn't looking at the men in the center. He was looking past them, straight at someone no one had noticed until now. Someone walking out from the shadow of the maintenance shed, tattoos glowing under the sun like fresh ink, eyes locked on Stoneback and Halo, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone. And when the yard realized who it was, the whisper spread like a spark catching dry grass. "Ghost Lace, he's back." No one knew why he was out there. No one knew what he wanted. But everyone understood immediately. Whatever was about to happen had just changed. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. Ghost Lace walked across Yard C like someone stepping out of an old memory, slow, steady, and sure, with a calm that didn't match the alarms still echoing off the concrete walls. The sun laid itself across his tattoos, a maze of thin white lines that curled around his chest and arms like threads of silk. The pale ink never darkened like other tattoos, it almost shone. That was how he'd earned the name everyone whispered. Nobody expected to see him again. Rumors said he'd been transferred. Others said he'd been locked in the secure housing unit for something that had happened 2 years ago, something nobody talked about openly. Stoneback noticed him first, a slight raise of his chin, like a man seeing a ghost he wished had stayed buried. Halo didn't turn right away, but his expression tightened. If Stoneback was the anchor of the yard, Ghost Lace was the ripple that reached the far corners of the prison without ever lifting his voice. He stopped just a few yards from the circle that had formed around Stoneback and Halo. His eyes were calm, unreadable. "You two picked the wrong day," he said quietly. The officers stiffened, hands hovering near radios, unsure if they were about to deal with 3 problems instead of 2. The warden took a step forward, but another officer pulled him back gently. No one wanted to spark something that wasn't already burning. Halo finally turned to face him. "You don't even know what this is about." Ghost Lace didn't blink. "I know enough to say you're standing in the wrong place, with the wrong man, at the wrong time." Stoneback let out a low breath. "Been a while, Lace. Long enough for this yard to forget what happens when lines get crossed," Ghost Lace said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The yard heard him anyway. The warden tried again, calling out orders, but the wind swallowed his voice. The inmates didn't obey. They watched the 3 men standing in the center of the tension, each carrying a reputation sharp enough to shift the power inside those walls. Stoneback finally stepped forward, just slightly. "This doesn't concern you," he said. Ghost Lace tilted his head. "Everything in this place concerns me." There was no threat in his tone, just truth. Halo's jaw flexed again. "I'm not backing away." Ghost Lace looked at him for a long moment, studying him the way someone studies a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit. "What did he promise you?" he asked. Halo didn't answer. Stoneback did. "Respect," he said simply. "Something you forgot how to show." Ghost Lace's eyes shifted back to Stoneback, and the yard felt something slip under the surface. Something old, something unfinished. Whatever history these two shared, it ran deeper than simple tension. Even the officers sensed it now. The warden moved in finally, stepping between the tension lines with 2 lieutenants at his back. He raised his hand sharply. "Yard C is on freeze. No movement. Everyone stays exactly where they are." Stoneback didn't step back. Halo didn't step back. Ghost Lace didn't move at all. For a moment, the entire prison seemed to balance on a thin line stretched between those 3 men. Then, slowly, Ghost Lace took 1 step back. Then another. The yard exhaled. Even Stoneback blinked, surprised. Ghost Lace said only one thing before turning away. "This isn't over. The next move won't be on this yard." The warden seized the moment and signaled the officers to separate Stoneback and Halo. A wave of staff pushed through the circle, guiding men back toward the fence lines. The tension didn't disappear. It simply folded itself into the corners of the prison where it could wait, patient and heavy. Stoneback was escorted toward the program office, 2 officers on each side. Halo was moved the opposite direction. Neither resisted. Neither spoke. But both kept glancing toward the path Ghost Lace had taken, as if they knew his reappearance meant the yard was about to change in ways no one had prepared for. As the population was marched back inside, yard chatter rose in low currents. No one spoke too loudly. No one wanted to be caught talking about something they shouldn't. But everyone said the same thing in their own way. Ghost Lace had never returned to a yard without a reason. Inside the cell blocks, the noise swelled, doors clanging, boots stomping, radios clicking. Officers moved with that careful speed they used only when something serious had just been stopped or delayed. Halo reached his cell first. His cellmate, a quiet older man named Brooks, looked up with tired eyes. Brooks had a faded tattoo of a hawk stretched across his shoulder, wings spread to his collarbone. "They put us on lockdown?" Brooks asked. "Probably," Halo muttered, stepping inside. Brooks watched him for a long moment. "You look like someone pulled the rug out from under you." Halo didn't answer right away. He sat on the lower bunk, elbows on his knees, fingers tapping his thigh. "Stoneback was ready," he said finally, like he knew I'd step up. Brooks studied him. "And Lace? Why was he out there?" Halo shook his head. "I don't know, but he didn't come to break it up. He came to warn someone." Across the prison, in another block, Stoneback was locked into a holding cage while officers filled out paperwork. His hands were steady, but his eyes were focused on nothing, like he was listening to something far away. A rookie officer stood by the cage, shifting nervously. "You know him?" he asked quietly. Stoneback didn't look up. "Know who?" "That guy on the yard. Ghostlace. The one the warden seemed worried about." Stoneback gave a slow exhale. "Everybody knows Lace. Some of us just wish we didn't." Before the officer could ask more, another sergeant called him away. Stoneback leaned his head back against the metal and let his eyes close. Whatever he was thinking about, it wasn't fear. It was calculation, the kind that comes right before a storm. And Ghostlace, somewhere deep in the prison, walked with calm steps toward his own cell, his white-lined tattoos glowing in the dim lights of the hallway. Men stepped aside without being told. Doors seemed to quiet as he passed. He paused only once, looking through a narrow window toward Yard C, now empty and silent. Then he whispered something under his breath, something only the concrete heard. By nightfall, every block in Salinas Valley State Prison was locked down. Cells echoed with small rumors and large worries. Officers walked with tense shoulders. Radios buzzed too often. But the deepest question, the one the entire prison quietly felt but no one dared speak, was simple. Why had Ghostlace come back to the yard at that moment? And what would happen when Stoneback and Halo realized he wasn't trying to stop them? He was preparing for something bigger. Night settled over Salinas Valley with a heavy stillness, the kind that made every sound echo a little too far. Lockdown lights glowed along the tiers, casting long shadows across the cells. The guards moved slower now, not from laziness but caution, like they were waiting for something to shift in the dark. In Halo's cell, Brooks had fallen asleep on the top bunk, breathing softly through his nose. Halo stayed awake, restless, staring through the narrow slit of a window. The moonlight cut through the glass in a pale horizontal line that landed across his chest, right over the tattooed sun on his hand. He traced the edges with his thumb, the gesture small, thoughtful. He kept replaying the moment in the yard. Stoneback's calm stance. The way the crowd formed. The stillness before everything cracked open. But it was Ghostlace's arrival that stayed in his mind the longest. The man hadn't shown fear. He hadn't shown anger. He had shown intention, steady, deliberate, controlled. As if he knew something no one else did. Halo didn't want to admit it, but the thought made his stomach twist. Brooks shifted above him, waking slightly. "You still up?" he murmured. Halo didn't look away from the window. "Yeah. You're not thinking straight," Brooks said quietly, rubbing his eyes. "You're letting things from the yard get too deep in your head." Halo kept his voice low. "Stoneback knew I'd challenge him." Brooks sighed. "You challenged him because you wanted to stop being someone people walked around. But Lace stepping out there? That wasn't about you or Stoneback. That was something else." Halo turned toward him. "What do you mean something else?" Brooks leaned over the edge of the top bunk, lowering his voice. "Ghostlace doesn't move without purpose. People like him never show up unless the ground under us is shifting." Halo swallowed. "So what does he want?" Brooks shook his head. "That's the problem. Nobody knows." Across the prison, in a different wing, Stoneback leaned against the wall of his cell. The guards had finally cleared him from the holding cage and marched him back to his unit. His cellmate had been moved months ago, leaving Stoneback alone, a request that had been approved faster than most people understood. His tattoos, thick lines and heavy shading, darkened in the dim light. He touched one of the wolves across his collarbone, fingers brushing the ink. It was a habit he'd never dropped. The wolves meant something, though no one alive had heard him say what. A soft knock came from the bars. Stoneback looked up sharply. It wasn't a guard. A man stood just outside the cell, leaning casually on the bars, his arms inked with spirals that twisted like vines up to his shoulders. Jax, known for keeping his ear to the ground and his name off everyone's paperwork. He was the kind of inmate who heard whispers before guards did. "You're awake," Jax said quietly. Stoneback didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jax stepped closer. "People are talking about today. They're saying Halo made a move. They're saying you let him." Stoneback's voice came calm. "People say a lot of things." Jax nodded but didn't leave. "And they're saying Lace is out." Stoneback's eyes sharpened. "What about it?" Jax lowered his voice even further. "People are guessing why." Stoneback folded his arms. "Guessing won't help them." Jax hesitated before speaking again. Lace was asking around. Quietly. Subtle. "He wants to know who passed a message from Block D last week." Stoneback's jaw tightened, the first crack in his calm all night. "What message?" Jax shrugged. "Nobody knows the details. only that someone carried it across blocks without permission. Lace is trying to find out who. Stoneback's eyes drifted away, thinking, calculating. And you came to tell me because? Jax gave a half-smile. Because if Lace comes looking for answers, he'll start with the people who know how information moves. Which means he might come to you next. Stoneback's silence said more than words. Jax stepped back. That's all I got, he said, and disappeared down the tier. Stoneback rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of invisible pieces sliding on a board he hadn't touched yet. When he finally sat down, the metal bunk creaked under his weight, but the sound barely registered. Something had started. Something bigger than a yard confrontation. And whatever message Ghost Lace was chasing, it was important enough for him to walk back onto a yard he had stayed off for nearly 2 years. Far across the prison, in the administrative wing, Warden Keeler stood in his office staring at 3 monitors. 2 showed different angles of Yard C from earlier that day. The third showed a freeze frame of Ghost Lace walking out from behind the maintenance shed. The warden rubbed his forehead. He was a tall, cautious man with peppered hair and sleeves always rolled up. Tonight, stress lined the corners of his eyes. Why today, he whispered. Lieutenant Corbin entered the room with a tablet under his arm. Lockdowns holding. No movement. No chatter on the phones. The warden didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the image of Ghost Lace. Send me Lace's activity logs from the last 72 hours. Corbin hesitated. Sir, Lace didn't have movement hours today. Keeler finally turned. So how did he end up on the yard? Corbin swallowed. We don't know yet. The warden's voice dropped lower. Find out. If Lace is moving without authorization, we have a breach. If someone let him out without reporting it, we have a bigger problem. Corbin nodded and left the room. Keeler stared at the image once more. The pale markings on Ghost Lace's chest and arms stood out even on the grainy footage. He zoomed in, though it didn't tell him anything new. Then he whispered the same question the inmates were asking. What is he after? Back in the blocks, Ghost Lace lay on his lower bunk, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. The pale ink on his chest traced thin paths like stitched scars, glowing faintly in the bluish security light. A folded scrap of paper sat on the floor beside his bunk. He'd found it slipped under his door after dinner. He hadn't opened it yet. He reached down and picked it up. The paper was small, the handwriting uneven. He unfolded it. The message inside was only 3 words. I didn't talk. Lace stared at the note for a long time, unreadable. Then he crumpled it gently and let it fall beside the bunk. His breathing stayed steady, but his eyes troubled the quiet. Back in Halo's cell, the lights dimmed further, signaling sleep hours. Brooks finally settled into deep breathing, the kind that filled the room with a soft rhythm. Halo still didn't sleep. He kept thinking about the way Ghost Lace had looked at him, like Halo wasn't the reason the yard stopped, like he was just a piece in something larger. He hated that feeling, being a piece, being used. He stood, walked to the bars, and gripped them tightly. Somewhere in the prison, Stoneback was awake too. Somewhere in the prison, Ghost Lace traced the lines of a puzzle only he understood. And somewhere, hidden behind someone's silence, the missing message waited for morning. A message that tied all 3 men together in a way none of them had spoken out loud. When the lights finally dimmed to black, the prison fell into a restless quiet. But beneath that quiet, something sharp was taking shape. And by sunrise, it would cut through the peace the warden hoped would hold. Morning rose cold and colorless over Salinas Valley. The fog clung to the fences, softening the razor wire into blurred silver lines. Yard C stayed empty, sealed off while officers walked its edges with stiff shoulders and watchful eyes. The air felt tighter than usual, as if the prison itself refused to take a full breath. Inside the blocks, doors slid open for morning count. Halo stepped out first, standing straight, trying to look unreadable even though his mind had barely rested. Brooks climbed down from the top bunk, rubbing sleep from his eyes, studying Halo quietly. You look worse than last night, Brooks said. Halo didn't respond. He kept his eyes forward, listening for something, anything, that might hint at the next move. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe Stoneback trying to send a message. Maybe guards moving with unusual speed. Maybe Ghost Lace passing by again. But Count passed without trouble. No warnings. No raised voices. The silence might have felt calm in any other prison. Here it felt staged. As they stepped back inside, Brooks tapped his arm gently. Listen. Whatever storm you started on that yard, you need to think before you walk into the next one. Halo breathed slowly. I'm already in it. Brooks sighed. Then at least understand the pieces. Stoneback isn't someone you stand in front of unless you believe you can win. People listen to him because he doesn't chase power. He holds it by standing still. And Ghostlace, he's something different. Halo's jaw tightened. Different how? Brooks hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. Lace sees things before anyone else does. He catches what the rest of us miss. There's a reason nobody celebrates when he comes out of nowhere. Halo didn't want to admit it, but the truth stung. He wasn't sure anymore if he had triggered something or stepped into something already in motion. Across the prison, Stoneback waited at his cell bars for the officers to finish their checks. He stood tall, calm, collected, the same presence he'd held on the yard. But his eyes held a tension he didn't show to anyone. Jax appeared again at the far end of the tier, moving casual but quick, like someone pretending he wasn't carrying information. He stopped by Stoneback's cell, leaning on the rails with practiced ease. You heard? Jax asked. Stoneback didn't look at him. Heard what? Warden's holding Lace for questioning, Jax said. Took him out early this morning. They're trying to find out how he ended up on the yard without clearance. Stoneback's head tilted slightly. They won't get an answer. Jax gave a dry chuckle. That's what makes them nervous. Stoneback finally looked his way. What else? Jax lowered his voice. Block D is locked down tighter than the others. Someone snitched about a message moving through last week. Guards are searching cells, asking questions. They're looking for whoever carried it. Stoneback's gaze sharpened. And they think I know who. You usually do, Jax said with a small shrug. But if Lace is looking too, then this isn't normal block gossip. It's something bigger. Stoneback stepped away from the bars, ending the conversation without words. Jax took the hint and slipped away. Stoneback sat on his bunk, tapping his fingers on his knee, piecing together a pattern the rest of the prison hadn't seen yet. Meanwhile, the administration wing buzzed with more urgency than usual. Warden Keeler sat across from Ghostlace in a small, plain interview room. The walls were thick, the windows narrow. A camera blinked softly in the corner. Ghostlace sat relaxed, hands on the table, posture steady. His white-lined tattoos traced calm paths over his arms, almost glowing against his skin. He looked like someone who didn't mind being there at all. That alone put the lieutenant behind him on edge. Keeler folded his hands. You weren't scheduled for yard time yesterday. Ghostlace held his gaze. I know. Then explain how you got there. I walked. Keeler sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. That's not an answer. Ghostlace shrugged lightly. It's the only one I have. Keeler studied him. You didn't react when officers ordered the yard to freeze. You didn't move until you chose to. What? Because I didn't go out there to react, Lace said calmly. I went to watch. The warden leaned forward. Watch what? Ghostlace paused, like he was choosing words carefully. The wrong people moving in the wrong direction. Keeler frowned. Meaning? Lace didn't elaborate. He didn't even blink. Keeler pushed a folder across the table. Someone moved a message through Block D last week. Someone who shouldn't have. We believe you know something about it. Ghostlace's expression didn't change. If you believed that, you wouldn't be asking. You'd be accusing. Keeler tapped the table lightly. Why did you cross the yard when you did? You knew Rendell and Serrano were seconds away from escalating a situation. Ghostlace tilted his head slightly. They weren't escalating anything. The lieutenant behind him stiffened. They were seconds from. Ghostlace cut in smoothly. If they wanted to start something, they would have. That wasn't what that moment was. Keeler leaned back. Then what was it? Ghostlace gave a faint, almost thoughtful smile. A warning. To who? Keeler asked. Ghostlace finally let the silence stretch. When he answered, his voice came soft. To everyone. Keeler didn't like that answer. He could feel the edges of something bigger forming, something he didn't have full visibility on. It was the one thing he hated about this prison, the constant sense of being 3 steps behind the inmates who understood the undercurrents better than the staff ever could. Before he could ask more, an officer opened the door and handed the lieutenant a note. The lieutenant read it, then nodded quickly. Sir, he said to the warden, something's happening in Block B. Keeler stood immediately. What? Officers found something in a vent behind one of the lower-tier cells. Keeler narrowed his eyes. What exactly did they find? The lieutenant hesitated, sending a glance at Lace. Keeler snapped, out with it. A note, the lieutenant said. And part of a map. Ghost Lace lowered his eyes slowly, like he'd expected this. Keeler looked back at him sharply. Should I assume you know what that means? Ghost Lace gave a small exhale. It means someone is getting sloppy. Keeler stared at him. Sloppy with what? Ghost Lace didn't answer. Instead, he stood up as the officer moved to cuff him again. He didn't resist, didn't argue. But before they let him out, he said one more thing. Check the vents in Block D. You'll find what you're really looking for. Keeler's face paled. Back in Halo's unit, an officer suddenly appeared at the bars and called out, Serrano, step out. Hands behind your back. Brooks sat up straight. What's this about? The officer didn't answer. Halo shot Brooks a tense look, then stepped into the hallway. The energy around the guards was different. Focused. Sharp. They weren't escorting him for routine questioning. As Halo was walked down the tier, Stoneback watched from inside his cell as they passed. Their eyes met for half a second. Stoneback's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on the bars. Halo was taken toward the program office, but not the usual interrogation rooms. The halls were too quiet. The entire yard froze as the echoes of the alarm bounced off the concrete walls. Even the men who usually acted like nothing could shake them lowered their heads and stepped back toward the fences. Officers rushed in from every angle, forming a moving wall of uniforms and shields. Dust hung in the air, floating like pale smoke over the scene. Lorenzo Switchblade Mendez stood at the center of the chaos, breathing hard, his tattooed arms locked tight as he resisted the officers surrounding him. He looked like someone who had already decided he had nothing else to lose. What made the moment even stranger was what everyone saw next. Cray's crew didn't move a single inch. They just stared, silent, watching as officers circled Switchblade. It wasn't respect. It wasn't fear. It felt more like they were waiting for something only they knew was coming. Cray himself stood near the basketball hoop, his long black hair tied in a knot, his chest inked with symbols that nobody fully understood. His eyes were fixed on Switchblade, unblinking, almost calm. There was no shouting, no taunts, not even a smile. Just a stare. A stare that made even the newest inmates tense up, because when Cray went that quiet, it usually meant he had already decided what would happen next. Officers finally forced Switchblade to his knees and cuffed him. 2 guards gripped each arm as they lifted him back to his feet. But right before they dragged him away, Switchblade twisted his neck and locked eyes with Cray. The whole yard seemed to inhale at once. It wasn't hatred between them. It wasn't fear either. It was something more dangerous, unfinished business. As Switchblade was escorted toward the gate, the tension spread like a wave. Small groups whispered. Others pretended not to care, but kept glancing at Cray. Everyone in the yard understood that whatever had just happened wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a bigger storm. When the yard doors finally slammed shut, quiet rolled across the space. Officers kept their shields up. Nobody talked. Even the birds that usually perched on the razor wire stayed away. Finally, one officer shouted for everyone to line up and prepare to return to the housing units. The yard felt colder than before, as if the sun had dimmed behind the thick gray clouds gathering overhead. Inside the housing block, the atmosphere was no better. Officers moved with sharp, strict energy, checking cells, inspecting belts, looking at faces a little longer than usual. Word spread fast. Switchblade was being placed in administrative segregation again. Some inmates said he might be transferred. Others thought he'd be back within a week. But the real fear wasn't about Switchblade returning. It was about what would happen before he did. That evening, the block settled into a heavy calm. The air smelled faintly of deodorizer and metal. Some men played cards at the tables, barely speaking. Others lay on their bunks, staring up at the ceiling. A few whispered through vents in quiet, coded messages. The televisions in the dayroom flickered with news stories that nobody really listened to. On the second tier, in cell 214, 2 men leaned close to their door. One was tall and lean, with faded blue ink along his ribs. The other was shorter, heavier, with a serpent running across his collarbone. They spoke in low, tight voices. "You think Cray plotted that?" the shorter one whispered. The tall one shrugged. "If he did, we'll feel it soon." A pause. A long one. "But what if Switchblade's the one who planned it?" he asked. This time the answer came fast. "Then we'll feel it even sooner." Downstairs, Cray sat in his cell alone. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't call out to his crew, didn't even lift his head when officers checked on him. His tattoos seemed darker under the dim yellow light. The crosses on his hands, the abstract designs across his back, the large faded bird stretching across his shoulder blade. He sat still, elbows on his knees, staring straight ahead at the wall. Nobody knew what was going through his mind, but almost everyone agreed on one thing. Cray wasn't finished. As night settled over the prison, a wind kicked up, blowing dust across the yard and rattling the fence. The block lights flickered once, just enough to make several inmates sit upright. Officers said it was just a glitch. The men inside weren't so sure. Right before lights out, a shout echoed from somewhere down the hall. Not loud, not panicked, but sharp. A signal, a warning, or maybe a challenge. Officers rushed toward the sound. Doors clanged. Radios crackled. And then the entire block went silent again. Too silent. Moments later, an officer sprinted past the cells, calling for backup. Something had happened. Something behind one of those metal doors. And whatever it was about to drag Salinas Valley into a night the prison wouldn't forget. The alarm blared again, louder this time. A harsh metallic wail that bounced off every wall in the building. Cell doors rattled as officers ran down the block, boots hitting the concrete floor in fast, heavy strikes. Inmates sat up on their bunks, eyes wide, listening, waiting. No one dared to speak. A strange pressure filled the air, like the whole prison was holding its breath. Down the hall, officers crowded around cell 319. Flashlights hit the edges of the bars, slicing beams of white through the shadowed tier. The door was still locked, still sealed, but something inside had triggered the emergency call button. Nobody could hear voices. Nobody could see movement. It was the kind of silence that made the back of your neck prickle. When officers finally opened the door, the noise of the hinges echoed like thunder. Inside stood a man everyone knew, Devin York. Tattooed from his shoulders to his wrists, black flames, a skull wrapped in chains, and a faded script name across his chest. Devin was one of Cray's most loyal soldiers, rarely speaking unless Cray spoke first. His face was calm now, too calm, as if the chaos outside his cell didn't touch him at all. He raised his hands slowly and nodded toward the corner of the room. There, sitting against the wall, hands bound in front of him, was an inmate nobody expected to see. Jordan Hale, one of Switchblade's closest associates, someone who always moved in his shadow. Jordan's face was tired, but not terrified, more like resigned. Officers rushed in and lifted him to his feet. Jordan didn't resist. He just muttered something under his breath, 3 words that made the nearest officer freeze. "He's coming back." The officer asked who he meant, but Jordan didn't speak again. He kept his eyes on Devin York until he disappeared down the hall. Devin, still standing in his cell, didn't react, didn't shout, didn't move. He only stared at the wall straight ahead, jaw tight, like a man who knew he had just played the opening move in a game nobody else fully understood. When officers cuffed him and began walking him toward the stairs, other inmates leaned forward in their cells. Some whispered. Some shook their heads. A few stepped back from their doors as Devin passed. Not out of fear, out of recognition. A message had been sent tonight. And it wasn't Switchblade sending it, and it wasn't Cray. It was someone behind them, above them, or someone new entering the picture entirely. As the block moved into full lockdown, rumors sprinted through the air faster than the officers sealing the tier. Some said Jordan had tried to switch sides. Others said Switchblade had contacted someone outside. A few believed Devin acted alone. But the truth was nobody knew, because the moment Jordan said those words, "He's coming back," the entire prison shifted. Return from where? Return when? Return for what? Hours later, long after the alarms stopped, long after the radios went silent, a single transport van rolled through the front gates of Salinas Valley. Its headlights cut through the thin fog settling over the yard. The vehicle slowed near the intake building. Officers stepped out, stiff and serious. Inside the van, behind darkened glass, sat a figure no one on the yard had seen in months. A figure with a long scar under his right eye. A figure with tattoos running up both arms like vines. A figure who once controlled half the violence in C facility. Lorenzo Switchblade Mendez was being brought back to general population. The moment his boots hit the concrete, something shifted in the prison's air again. Tense, heavy, electric. Officers escorted him inside, but Switchblade didn't look scared, didn't look angry. He looked focused, Like a man walking back into a story he had every intention of finishing. As he disappeared through the metal doors, one officer muttered under his breath, "It's going to be one of those weeks." Inside the cell block, Cray sat on the edge of his bunk, head tilted slightly, listening to the faint sound of chains and footsteps echoing down the corridor. His hand rested over the black bird tattoo on his shoulder. His eyes, sharp and cold, didn't blink once. Whatever was coming, he was ready. The next morning, before the sun even touched the towers, the entire prison buzzed with one truth. The two most unpredictable men in Salinas Valley were back under the same roof. And everyone knew. Only one of them was going to walk out on top. Salinas Valley has held some of the toughest men California has ever seen, but every time one rivalry cools, another rises right behind it. The stories inside these walls rarely end clean. They don't fade out gently. They circle back, collide, twist, and come roaring to life when nobody expects it. In this chapter, we saw the lines begin to shift again, old alliances cracking, hidden plans revealing themselves, and a power struggle that's far from finished. But Salinas Valley is deeper than any single moment. There are stories behind every door, every tattoo, every quiet stare in the yard. If you want the next chapter, if you want to see what happens when Switchblade and Cray finally cross paths again, let me know, and I'll continue the story right where it left off. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.